The rain pelted against the windows with a relentless fury, each drop sounding like tiny fingers tapping to be let in. Claire Thompson sat alone in her quiet suburban home, the rhythmic patter of the storm her only company. She had always found the rain soothing, a gentle reminder of the world outside, but tonight it felt different. There was something oppressive in the air, a heaviness that made her uneasy. The lights flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the walls, and the wind howled as if something unseen was crying out in the night. She tried to focus on the book in her lap, but her mind kept drifting. The house was old, and every creak and groan seemed louder, more menacing in the darkness. She was grateful for the storm outside. It drowned out the sounds of the house settling, masking the unsettling noises that had a way of creeping into her thoughts. But then, amidst the cacophony of the storm, she heard something that made her blood run cold. It was faint at first, barely discernible, but there was no mistaking it. A soft, muffled sound coming from the basement. She froze, straining to listen, her heart thudding in her chest. The sound was distant, almost as if it was trying to reach her from another time, another place. It was the sound of a child crying. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the storm playing with her mind. But the crying persisted, growing louder, more desperate. She tried to ignore it, telling herself there was no way a child could be down there. The basement had been locked for years, ever since she moved in. But the sound tugged at her, gnawing at her sense of reason, until she couldn't take it anymore. With a trembling hand, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the basement door. It was an old, heavy door, the wood warped and worn by years of neglect. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the cold, rusted doorknob. The crying was clearer now, a pitiful, heart-wrenching sound that clawed at her insides. It was unmistakably a child, but how could that be? She swallowed hard and turned the knob. The door creaked open, and the smell of damp earth and decay wafted up from the darkness below. Claire shuddered, her mind screaming at her to turn back, to lock the door and forget she had ever heard anything. But she couldn't. Something was down there, something that needed her. The steps groaned under her weight as she descended into the basement, the narrow beam of the flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The crying grew louder with each step, echoing off the concrete walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. It was everywhere and nowhere, filling the space with a sense of dread that wrapped around her like a shroud. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped, her flashlight scanning the room. The basement was just as she remembered it, cluttered with old furniture, forgotten boxes, and the detritus of lives long past. But there in the corner, something caught her eye. A small, dusty box, half hidden under a pile of old blankets. The crying seemed to be coming from it, but that was impossible. She approached the box, her heart hammering in her chest. With a shaky hand, she lifted the blankets away, revealing an old, battered tape recorder. It looked ancient, its metal casing tarnished with age, but somehow it was still functional. As she stared at it, the crying stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that made her skin crawl. Then, without warning, the tape recorder clicked on. The sound of the whirring tape filled the basement, and Claire felt a chill run down her spine as a voice began to play. It was the voice of a child, soft and trembling, filled with a terror that sent a jolt of fear through her. "Help me," the voice whispered, barely audible over the static. "Please help me." Claire's hands shook as she reached for the recorder, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The voice continued, growing more frantic, more desperate. "They hurt me," the child's voice cried, the sound raw with pain. "They won't let me go. I'm trapped. Please make them stop." Claire's mind raced. This had to be some kind of sick joke, a prank left by the previous owners. But the fear in the child's voice was too real, too visceral to be fake. The tape recorder whirred again, the child's sobs filling the room, and Claire felt her stomach turn as the voice began to recount events that had happened in the house. Horrors that she had never heard of, things that had been buried in the past. "They locked me down here," the voice sobbed. "In the dark. I was so scared. They said I was bad. They said I had to stay. But it hurts. It hurts so much. Claire's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the voice became more distorted, the static growing louder, the cries more anguished. She wanted to stop the tape, to silence the horrifying sound, but she was paralyzed by fear, unable to tear herself away. The child's voice was louder now, almost deafening, and it seemed to be coming from all around her, not just from the tape recorder. It was as if the walls themselves were crying out, begging for release. Claire's vision blurred with tears as the voice became more guttural, more inhuman. The words twisted into something dark and unnatural. "They're here," the voice growled. No longer a child's, but something else entirely. "They're still here, and they want you." The room plunged into darkness as the flashlight flickered and died. Claire's heart raced, her hands fumbling to find the stairs. But the basement was pitch black, the air thick with the stench of decay. The crying had stopped, but in its place came a low, menacing whisper that seemed to crawl up from the depths of the earth. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, and Claire felt something cold brush against her skin, something wet and slimy that made her scream. "You're ours now." Panic seized her as she stumbled in the dark, her fingers scraping against the rough stone walls. She could hear them now, the things that the voice had spoken of, moving in the shadows, their presence heavy and suffocating. She had to get out, but the basement seemed to stretch on forever, the stairs lost in the darkness. A sudden surge of cold air swept through the room, and Claire felt herself being pulled, as if invisible hands were dragging her back, away from the stairs. She fought against it, kicking and screaming, but the force was too strong, too relentless. The last thing she saw before she was swallowed by the darkness was the tape recorder, its play button still pressed down, the tape still spinning. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a chorus of tortured souls. But inside the basement, all was silent. The house stood empty, the only sound the soft click of the tape recorder as it reached the end of the tape, ready to play again. The storm raged with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. Inside, James Harper sat alone, his eyes fixed on the flickering light of the fireplace. The warmth of the flames did little to soothe the unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had always enjoyed the solitude of his remote home, nestled deep in the woods, but tonight, the isolation felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The storm had rolled in quickly, dark clouds swallowing the last light of day, turning the world outside into a shadowy blur. James had planned to spend the evening reading, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He told himself it was just the storm, the power of nature playing tricks on his mind, but deep down, he knew it was something more. As the wind howled and the rain poured down, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the noise, a loud thud from the back of the house. James stiffened, his heart skipping a beat. He listened intently, but all he could hear was the relentless pounding of the rain. He tried to convince himself it was just a branch falling or the wind rattling something loose, but the unease gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the mantel. The thud had come from the direction of the back door, and with every step he took toward it, the sense of dread deepened. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the shadows stretching and twisting with each flicker of the dying firelight. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. When he reached the back door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The old wooden door creaked as he slowly opened it, revealing the darkened kitchen beyond. The cold draft that blew in made him shiver, and he cursed under his breath. He must have left the door unlocked, and the wind had forced it open. But as he stepped inside, something caught his eye, muddy footprints leading from the door, trailing across the floor. James froze, his blood turning to ice. The prints were large, too large to belong to a child, and they were fresh, the mud still wet and glistening in the dim light. But the most unsettling part was the direction they led, not out of the house, but deeper into it. His grip tightened on the flashlight as he followed the trail, his pulse pounding in his ears. The footprints led through the kitchen and into the living room, where they seemed to multiply. What had been a single set of prints was now two, then three, as if whoever or whatever had made them had brought others along. The realization sent a chill down his spine. He was supposed to be alone. He had locked all the doors, hadn't he? James's mind raced as he followed the trail. The prints split off in different directions, some leading toward the stairs, others to the study, and more still disappearing into the darkened hallway. It was as if the house had become a labyrinth, each set of prints leading to a different part of it. He could hear the wind howling outside, but now there was something else, too. Faint whispers carried on the air, barely audible, but unmistakably real. He strained to listen, his heart pounding as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, an eerie cacophony of voices just out of reach. And then, among the whispers, he heard something else, soft, distant laughter, the kind that sent shivers down his spine. James's breath caught in his throat. The laughter wasn't joyous or lighthearted. It was sinister, mocking, as if the unseen presence in his home was toying with him, enjoying his fear. He turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but the laughter echoed off the walls, disorienting him. The footprints had led him into the center of the house, surrounded by darkness and the ever-present whispers. Desperation clawed at him. He knew he had to get out, had to escape whatever had invaded his home, but the footprints kept appearing, leading him deeper into the maze of his own making. Every door he opened revealed another set of prints, leading to another part of the house. The whispers grew louder, the laughter more menacing, until it felt like the very walls were closing in on him. He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as if it, too, was succumbing to the malevolent presence in the house. The floor beneath him creaked, and he realized with horror that the footprints were now surrounding him, encircling him like a predator closing in on its prey. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices overlapping, growing louder and more frantic, until they filled his head, drowning out all rational thought. James's heart raced as he turned and ran, the flashlight swinging wildly in his hand. The laughter followed him, echoing through the hallways, growing louder with each step. He could feel them now, the unseen presences closing in on him from all sides. The mud on the floor seemed to spread, the footprints multiplying until the entire house felt alive with the presence of something dark, something evil. He burst into the living room, his eyes wide with terror, but the sight that greeted him was worse than anything he had imagined. The footprints were everywhere, crisscrossing the floor, leading up the walls, even across the ceiling, as if the house itself had become a twisted, upside-down world where the laws of reality no longer applied. And there, in the center of the room, was a figure barely visible in the flickering light. It was tall, its form obscured by shadow, but its eyes gleamed with a cold, malevolent light. The figure stood motionless, its head tilted as if observing him, studying him. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, the voices overlapping, growing louder until they were all he could hear. "Get out!" The voices hissed in unison, the words twisting and distorting, filling his mind with a crushing fear. "You're not alone. You'll never be alone." James's scream caught in his throat as the figure moved, stepping toward him with slow, deliberate strides. The footprints on the floor shifted, moving of their own accord, the mud spreading like a stain, creeping toward him. He turned to flee, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, the force of it reverberating through the house. He was trapped. The flashlight flickered one last time before going out, plunging him into darkness. The laughter echoed in the pitch black, the whispers now a cacophony of madness that clawed at his sanity. He stumbled back, his hands groping for something, anything to hold on to, but the darkness was absolute, swallowing him whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The whispers faded into silence, leaving him alone in the dark, the only sound the frantic beating of his own heart. But he knew deep down that he wasn't alone. The footprints in the mud had led him here, and now whatever had left them was waiting. He could feel it, the presence just out of sight, watching him, its cold breath on the back of his neck. James squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling with fear, but there was no escape. The house was no longer his. It belonged to something else now, something ancient and malevolent that had been waiting for him all along. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling through the trees, but inside the house there was only silence. And in that silence, James knew that he would never leave. The footprints had led him to this moment, and now there was no turning back. In the darkness, a single, soft whisper reached his ear, sending a final, paralyzing chill down his spine. "Welcome home." The storm outside raged with a ferocity that shook the small house to its core. Wind howled through the trees, and rain lashed against the windows, turning the world outside into a chaotic blur. Inside, Sarah Miller tried to steady her nerves, listening to the thunder rolling in the distance, each clap louder than the last. She sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp the only comfort against the tempest brewing outside. She had always found storms unsettling, but tonight felt different. There was an unease in the air, a sense of something waiting just beyond the edge of perception. The lights flickered, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She watched as the shadows in the room stretched and danced with each flash of lightning, creating eerie shapes that seemed to move on their own. Then, without warning, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, ghostly light. Sarah cursed under her breath, fumbling her way to the drawer where she kept a stash of candles. As she struck a match and lit the first candle, a warm, flickering glow filled the room, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. With the candle in hand, she made her way back to the living room, her footsteps eerily loud in the silence that had fallen over the house. The large, ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace caught her eye, its surface reflecting the dim light of the candle. She stared at her reflection for a moment, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to her like a shroud. As she moved to set the candle down, something caught her attention. Her reflection hadn't moved with her. It still stood in the center of the mirror, staring back at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to process what she was seeing. She blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light. But when she looked again, the reflection was still there, motionless, its eyes locked onto hers. A bolt of lightning lit up the room, and for a split second, the reflection twisted, its features warping into something grotesque and unfamiliar. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding as she clutched the candle to her chest. The mirror returned to normal, but the image of that twisted reflection was burned into her mind. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. The storm, the darkness, it was all getting to her. But as she took a step closer to the mirror, the reflection didn't follow. It remained rooted in place, its eyes following her every move, a sinister smile slowly curling at the corners of its mouth. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached out toward the mirror, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. The reflection's hand moved as well, but in a twisted parody of her movements, its fingers splayed out in unnatural angles, the grin on its face growing wider. She jerked her hand back, the candle flickering wildly as her breath came in short, ragged gasps. Another flash of lightning, and the reflection changed again. The face staring back at her was no longer her own. It was a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, its skin pale and stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. The smile had twisted into something feral, hungry, as if the reflection was savoring her fear. It leaned closer, its hand pressing against the other side of the glass, fingers curling into claws. Sarah staggered back, her mind racing as panic set in. This couldn't be real. Mirrors didn't behave like this. But the thing in the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else, something malevolent. She could feel its presence, a cold, creeping sensation that slithered down her spine and wrapped around her heart. The room was plunged into darkness as the candle suddenly went out. For a moment, the only light came from the flashes of lightning outside, casting the room in stark, terrifying glimpses. Sarah's breath hitched as she realized she could still see the reflection, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, its mouth opening in a soundless scream. Desperate, she grabbed another match and relit the candle, but the light did nothing to banish the horror before her. The figure in the mirror was moving now, its twisted limbs contorting as it pushed against the glass, trying to break free. Sarah watched in terror as cracks began to spiderweb across the surface of the mirror, the thing inside pressing harder, its movements growing more frantic, more desperate. She turned to run, but her legs felt like lead. The air in the room had turned heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on her. The sound of shattering glass filled her ears as the mirror finally gave way, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped as she saw the figure begin to crawl out, its long, skeletal fingers gripping the edges of the broken frame. "No!" she screamed, backing away as the creature pulled itself free, its twisted body unfolding in impossible ways. The smile on its face was wide and grotesque, its eyes burning with a dark, unholy light. It moved toward her with unnatural speed, its limbs jerking and snapping as it closed the distance between them. Sarah tripped, falling to the floor as the creature loomed over her. It reached out, its cold, bony hand closing around her wrist. The touch was like ice, sending shockwaves of pain through her body. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, her voice stolen by the terror that gripped her. The creature's other hand reached for the mirror, and as it did, Sarah felt a powerful force pulling her toward it. She struggled, but it was no use. The thing was dragging her back to the mirror, back to the dark, twisted world it had come from. The broken glass cut into her skin as she was pulled closer, the edges of the mirror warping and twisting as they threatened to swallow her whole. In one final, desperate act, Sarah reached out and grabbed the candle, flinging it at the mirror with all her might. The flame caught the edge of the frame, and for a brief moment, the creature recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for her to pull away. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she ran for the door, the sound of the creature's wails echoing in her ears. She burst out into the night, the rain drenching her as she stumbled down the steps and into the storm. The wind howled around her, but she didn't stop running, didn't look back. She knew that if she did, she would see it, the twisted reflection, waiting just beyond the threshold, ready to pull her back into the darkness. And as she fled into the night, the last thing she heard was the shattering of glass behind her, followed by the soft, malevolent laughter that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The wind howled outside as a fierce storm battered the small suburban house. Emily Harris sat curled up on the couch, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders, trying to drown out the relentless rain pounding against the windows. The power had flickered a few times, casting the room into a fleeting darkness that sent her heart racing. But now, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminated the living room, creating long shadows that danced eerily with each flash of lightning. She was alone, her parents out of town for the weekend. Normally, Emily relished these moments of solitude, but tonight felt different. The storm was unsettling, each gust of wind rattling the windows like the desperate cries of something wanting in. She tried to focus on the book in her lap, but the words blurred as her mind wandered to the darkened corners of the room. Then, she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as it grew louder, Emily realized it was coming from the front door. A soft, rhythmic tapping, as if someone was gently knocking. She froze, her eyes darting toward the door. Who would be out in this weather? The thought of answering it made her skin crawl. She held her breath, waiting for the sound to stop, but it only grew more persistent. Tap, tap, tap. Maybe it's just the wind, she whispered to herself, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The knocks were too deliberate, too measured. Emily slowly stood, her legs trembling as she approached the door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob before deciding to check the peephole. As she peered through it, her breath hitched. There was nothing there, just the rain-soaked porch, empty and devoid of life. A sense of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Just as she was about to turn away, the tapping resumed, louder this time. Emily whipped her head back to the peephole, her heart pounding in her chest. Still, there was no one there. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer, just the relentless tapping. She could feel her pulse in her throat as she stared through the peephole, her eyes straining to see any sign of movement. And then she saw it, a shadow at the far end of the porch, barely visible through the sheets of rain. It was a figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure took a step closer, and then another. The knocking stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that filled the house. Emily's mind raced, torn between the urge to run and the need to know who, or what, was out there. She forced herself to look again, and this time, the figure was closer, its face just beyond the edge of the peephole's view. She backed away, her heart hammering as she tried to rationalize what she had seen. Maybe it was a neighbor, lost in the storm, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There was something wrong about that figure, something that set every nerve in her body on edge. The silence was shattered by another knock, this one so loud it echoed through the house. Emily screamed, backing away from the door as the figure's presence loomed larger in her mind. The knocks came faster now, more aggressive, as if the visitor was growing impatient. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen flashed no service, and Emily's fear escalated in a full-blown panic. She was trapped, alone, with whatever was outside. The doorknob rattled, and Emily's blood ran cold. The figure was trying to get in. She bolted to the back of the house, her mind racing for an escape plan. But the sound of footsteps on the porch followed her, slow and deliberate. Whoever or whatever it wasn't going to stop. She hid in the kitchen, crouching behind the counter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The knocking had ceased, replaced by an eerie quiet that felt even worse. She could feel the oppressive presence outside, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her. Minutes passed, each one dragging on like an eternity. Then, just as she began to think it was over, the back door creaked open. Emily's heart stopped. She hadn't locked it. She bit down on her lip to keep from screaming as she heard the slow, deliberate steps entering the house. The intruder was inside. She could hear the wet squelch of footsteps on the kitchen floor, growing closer with each passing second. Tears welled up in her eyes as she peeked around the corner. The figure was there, standing in the doorway, its face obscured by the darkness, but Emily could feel its eyes on her. It took a step forward, and then another, its shadow stretching across the floor toward her. Paralyzed with fear, Emily could do nothing but watch as the figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its fingers long and twisted. The air around her grew cold, her breath fogging in the unnatural chill. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure loomed over her now, its presence filling the room with a palpable dread. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But instead of a cold touch, she heard a whisper, soft, raspy, and filled with an ancient malice. "Let me in." Her eyes flew open, but the figure was gone. The room was empty, the door still wide open, rain pouring in. Emily's mind reeled, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She scrambled to her feet, slamming the door shut and locking it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The visitor was still out there, waiting, watching, biding its time. And the next time it knocked, She wasn't sure if she'd have the strength to keep it out.